Welcome to the final part of Enlightenment. I know you folks are probably sick of hearing his voice already. We're going to get on to part four, the final. This will focus primarily on the revolutions that are brought on from the Enlightenment ideals. So we have these new ideas. I told you the pen is mightier than the sword. We're going to see this in regards to both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and even the Haitian Revolution, along with the Latin American Revolution. So we have all these new ideas, these new words, that these words actually inspire action. These words give people a common language to use. This is the dawn of the new age to overthrow these governments of the past, these monarchs of the past. We also talked about, we start seeing more of the merchants having more power and more wealth, and eventually, again, it's going to lead to a development of another class known as middle class. And we see people wanting more rights to participate in politics, participate in the voting, and have a greater freedom of their expression. So, without further ado, we're looking at revolutions. We first need to realize there's two really types of revolutions. There's a tops-down revolution, and this is revolutions that, are the overthrow is from generals or the aristocracy or princes. And then there's also a bottoms-up revolution. This is people coming from the peasants, from the lower class, who are going to rise up, maybe the middle class, who are going to rise up and overthrow those on top. So if we're looking at history, history tells us revolutions tend to be bad. They usually start with a person's dreams of a better society, but then metamorphosize into another person's dream, which actually leads to either coming full circle, going back to where you started, or even we see revolutions in the past in history that end in a very horrific kind of way and lead to genocide or ethnic cleansings, or in regards to the French Revolution, a reign of terror. So most revolutions in history they don't end well. So do know that. So anytime you say, I want to have a revolution in America, do know, just check history, and do not, you will find that most do not end well. That said, we will find that the American Revolution actually ends very well. It's, really the first one I can think of off the top of my head, it actually ended well. And it's more of a top-down revolution. George Washington, the John Adams, the Thomas Jeffersons, these guys, the Patrick Henrys, these guys were on top of the American ladder in the American colonies. So do know that this is going to be more of a top-down revolution, the American Revolution, than a bottoms-up, where the French Revolution we're going to get into is going to be from the bottoms up. And if you look at revolutions in history, we don't know which direction they're going to go. And these Enlightenment ideas, they're going to come home to harvest, starting with the American Revolution of 1776. As I mentioned, the pen is mightier than the sword. Language, words, they have power. These colonists, the 13 colonies, are going to prove that these Enlightenment ideas work. This is going to turn into a massive experiment, this thing called democracy, this thing called, following the American Revolution, this founding of a new government. And, Enlightenment, we need to realize, as I have here in the background, is the backdrop. It's the context of the times. What do the times have to do with it? Everything. And, you're going to see that Enlightenment's going to empower these people, and they're going to empower and give language to the founding fathers to use and to implement in the first country that is a true Republican democracy as a nation. And these people, these founding fathers, all predominantly have something in common outside of George Washington. They're educated and are part of an elite class. Enlightenment is that kind of epic where the rights of mankind were better understood and they were defined thanks to the philosophers of the past. And, human rights comes to the forefront, and we'll see Enlightenment end some things. But for Enlightenment to come to America, it was difficult because you had to have the 13 colonies, who are part of the British colonies. It's not the United States of America. These are 13 separate colonies who have 13 separate interests that want to worry about themselves, these colonies. It's more region, I guess, than it is even than colony, but these colonies all have their own currencies. They all have their own way of doing things. It's not a unified government. So the trick was, how do we get these 13 colonies to all strike at once? How do we get them to come together? And when we have this, we're going to find things that actually unify them over time. And we look at the American Revolution, it's going to come as a byproduct of cause and effect. And we have a young George Washington over here who's part of the British military. He will be part of the rebellion later on because he's not part of aristocratic class. In Britain, it is a sharp divide between the aristocracy and those that kind of follow more of a feudal kind of system still. And you see George Washington, he becomes, I guess, turned off by the fact that he'll never be able to climb fully in the British military because he's not part of any kind of a elite family. Now, preceding that though, 1753, at the age of 21, he's going to be part of the British Army, and he's going to help kick off something known as the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. And in battle with the French, he's actually going to be captured. He'll have 2 horses shot out from beneath him. He'll have 4 holes in his coat. Death was all around him. He actually, from this battle with the French, he actually starts to believe he's invincible. He cannot die in combat. And he also realizes this European battle style in the American colonies, in this French and Indian War, and this is also known as 7 Years' War, as I mentioned, is these European tactics are kind of outdated. And this will help us in the American Revolution later on. George Washington shows at a young age that he is somebody who has very strong self-discipline, self-control, and he has a capacity to endure hardship. I'll give you an example. His father, he was not close to his father at all. He's pretty much raised by his half-brother, Lawrence. And Lawrence struggled from tuberculosis. So this is the only time George Washington ever left the United States. At the age of 19, he went down to Barbados and went down there to get warm weather for his brother, helping to cure him. While he's down there, he got smallpox. And he got a pot face, kind of marked face from the smallpox. But he'll survive it, obviously. And this will actually grow to be an immunity to smallpox, which will play a huge role in the American Revolution. When people are getting ravaged by smallpox, he will be fine from it. He'll be protected from it because of that. And he also believes in inoculation and actually vaccinating the troops and gave them small doses of smallpox. So this is something during the Revolutionary War people don't talk about, how disease played a role. And he believes in the vaccinations. Now, his brother Lawrence will die in 1752, a year later after Barbados, and George Washington will take over the estate at Mount Vernon. And he'll build off of that. He'll actually deck it out to attract, find a wife, and eventually Martha Washington, and he'll carry on his brother's legacy. But the 7 Years' War, the reason why I talk about it, the domino effect, is it cost the British a lot of money to win the 7 Years' War against France. The British will win, and they actually push France out of North America for the most part as a result of it. But because it was so expensive, they're going to start to do something, and they're going to start taxing Americans, which will eventually lead us to the American Revolution. And we see the Americans will rally around the concept of no taxation without representation, which is not new. The Irish used it against the British a generation earlier, about 15, 20 years earlier. And we're going to see that they're going to use the Enlightenment language to kind of, again, unify the nation. And next thing is, these 13 colonies are unified thanks to the taxes. Will help unify these different regions, these different colonies. Now, we argue that World War II is known as the Greatest Generation. Tom Brokaw termed that generation around the Great Depression, World War II. But you can make a strong, compelling argument that the Greatest Generation took place during the American Revolution, the founding of our country. Now, we look here. We kind of view the Revolutionary War as a PG-13 kind of film. It's not. It's rated R. It's graphic. It's horrible. It's war. War is hell. And it's no different in the American Revolution. And you could argue it's actually a civil war because we're going to have a lot of Americans who side with the British. When I say Americans, a lot of people from the colonies who side with the British. They're known as loyalists. And you have those who are siding with the American founding fathers. Those are known as the Patriots. So we see this kind of brother versus brother, father versus brother in this. From an outside perspective, the American Revolution is seen as David versus Goliath. We got to look at context. British is the largest empire in the world at the time. They are strong. They have the most powerful navy, the most powerful army, and most people do not give them a fighting chance, the Americans. And we're going to see that the outside world does not think we stand a chance either. Many Americans don't think we have a chance, and we're going to see this change over time, and we'll see David slay Goliath and behead Goliath as a result. And there's a good book I encourage you to read. It's called David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. It gives you a good context to David and Goliath, the story. Pretty cool stuff. But we need to remind ourselves England is actually fighting this war 3,000 miles away. And they're also fighting it with Spain and France, really hating, and Netherlands too, who hate Britain and all of its power. So they're going to actually put their navy out in Europe, which is going to keep Britain's navy, some of it, a large portion of it, to protect its homeland rather than send it across America. So this gives us an advantage there, get some advantages there. And then also the fighting style of the Americans will prove difficult for England, and the leadership of England will struggle as well. General Howe, who's control of the English military, he's going to be somebody who is more worried about his mistress in America than he is about fighting the Americans and taking them seriously. And this kind of hubris, this overconfidence from the British generalship is going to play into the hands of the American leaders who are fighting for survival. And again, as this war drags on and it became a war of attrition, much like Vietnam attrition, seeing who could last the longest, we have an advantage because we live here. We're home here. And we probably have a bigger advantage than they thought we did. General Greene, Nathaniel Greene, he'll argue that we fight, Americans fight, we get beat, we rise, and we fight again. And this is looking at the American Revolution. And we have famous portraits like this. When this painting was had, this is Washington crossing the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton. And it's not this cool looking. This kind of it glorifies war at this time. You can see why many boys get attracted by war looking at paintings like this. This is actually a future president here, James Monroe. He'll actually be one of the 2 or 3 people wounded. He gets shot in the chest, actually survives, becomes, I believe, the 5th president of the United States. But you see that this is, looking at this portrait crossing Delaware. At this time this painting's made, this is America's backs are against the wall. We're on the ropes. We just had Washington's had a catastrophic defeat, retreat from Long Island, and we're on a run, and many people start dropping out of the army, and they desert, and they believe we're going to lose this thing. And this is when George Washington has one of his great feats, the Battle of Trenton, which took place at the end of 1776. He states the game is pretty near up, and we need a victory. And at the end of the year also, we had a year-by-year commitment to soldiers to sign up and fight for the Americans. And you're going to see George Washington. He knows he has to make a gamble before this year is up, before his soldiers leave. And this is at the Battle of Trenton. And he's going to go meet 1,500 sleeping Hessians. These Hessians, these are German mercenaries. And you're going to have these mercenaries on Christmas night. They're going to even know, they're going to be told we're coming. They don't take it seriously. These guys are some bad dudes. These Hessians, they've trained since the age of 16. They're very rigorously disciplined military. I mean, these guys are like your elite Green Berets today, we call them. These guys that's all they do is train to kill. And spies had already informed the Hessians were coming. And the commander says, let them come. We'll go meet them with a bayonet. But when this battle kicks off after we cross this river, it's freezing out. You kind of have the same kind of D-Day kind of ships built, those Higgins boats. But you see that when we get there, the Hessian leader, and this is something the Patriots did a pretty good job of, will target leaders, the commanders early on in battles to try to create disorder. He will be shot in the stomach twice, and he will die. They actually find in his waistcoat, they find in that commander's waistcoat after the battle, a warning that was passed earlier in the night that from the spies that the Patriots were coming. And you will see that we win this battle, and this is going to be followed by another battle, the Battle of Princeton, that we win as well, which is it's a whole other topic. If you take CCP, I'll get into. But you see that the Americans, they show up. The Hessians weren't drunk. There were some that were, but most weren't. They're just caught by surprise, and we only have 4 wounded. One of those is James Monroe there, who, again, I said went on. Now, I'm going to step back here for a second, looking at the Cobra effect. This is a story that you look at cobras in India were a nuisance to British officials there. So what the British officials do is they offer bounties for the heads of cobras in India. Just bring this head of cobras to get rid of these cobras. What ends up happening is the Indians start bringing in all these heads to the British crowns in India, in these cities, in New Delhi, and eventually the British realize that the Indians are just breeding cobras, cutting their heads off and getting bounties. So they stop this. What ends up happening is that the Indians that are breeding cobras actually release all the cobras they've been breeding, and now we have more cobras than we started with. This is known as the cobra effect. This is the same as the taxes the British give to the American colonists. It's counterproductive. It may sound good to tax them. They identify themselves as British, most do, and this is going to have a cobra effect. It's going to lead to It's going to cost 4 times as much to enforce it than to actually collect the money. And we also start seeing people in the colonies start to organize against these taxes. And the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty are 2 different organizations. You'll see them start boycotting goods. They'll start to tar and feather, which is awful to people who get tarred and feathered. They're going to start doing that to these people. Then you have more taxes passed. You start seeing the Townshend Acts, and this is going to lead to the quartering of troops, British troops that get to station themselves in the homes of American colonists, and this is going to upset more Americans as a result. And they're questioning, if you're here to protect us from Indian attacks, why are you stationed here in cities on the East Coast? And they're going to question that. You're going to have the Sugar Act, and acts just mean taxes, and other taxes will be passed as well, and playing cards, and paper, and paint, lead, glass, tea, all those different things. So this will eventually, we'll see this thing snowball. This will lead to the Boston Massacre, which takes place 5 years before this thing kicks off, 1770. And you will see when colonists are throwing rocks and snowballs and ice and stuff at the British soldiers, they're going to open fire, killing 4 Americans. One of them is a former slave, Crispus Attucks. And you're going to see that this is going to be called the Boston Massacre. We see the power of perspective here. Again, from the British, it's not a massacre, it's 4 people. For the Americans, they're going to title it the Boston Massacre to kind of, again, incite some kind of anger. Now, Boston is the hotbed of this anti-British movement. It's a port city. A lot of taxes are impacting them. It's led by people like Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, I should say, will support it. John Adams as well. And we also see a Boston Tea Party that takes place 3 years after the massacre, 2 years before it kicks off. And we're going to see 150 colonists paint themselves black, dress up like Indians, board 3 British ships. This tea was coming in from China, and they're going to spend 3 hours dumping it into the water. So much of it that it actually comes back on the ships to shovel it off. And other tea parties are going to pop up after this. And the King George III, who's the head of England, is going to be irate. And he's going to send more taxes. And he's going to close the ports of Boston until they pay their taxes, pay back the tea that they spilled in the harbor. He's going to send soldiers in a couple years later, and we're going to see Lexington and Concord kick off. Now, as the American Revolution goes on, in 1776, before we have any kind of declaration, this guy writes a book called Common Sense. His name is Thomas Paine, and he's going to write this book, Common Sense, and it's going to spread like a wildfire. He actually uses a pseudonym. He doesn't use his real name at first, and we're going to see that he focuses his anger at the king, not Parliament. Most people blame Parliament. They thought King George III was fine. He focuses anger at the king, and he urges Americans to abandon the monarchy. And within 3 months of this book being written, it's more of a pamphlet, I should say, it's going to spread like a wildfire. 150,000 copies are sold, and that 150,000, you got to figure they're going to sharing that pamphlet with other people. And his big argument is it makes no sense for an island to rule a continent. This is really going to give us language, going to inspire the colonialists, colonists, I should say, to come together. Gives us that common language that pen is mightier than the sword, and to embrace independence. And kind of rouses the spirits like none other. And Thomas Paine, he says quotes like, "These are the times that try men's souls. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." And that is Thomas Paine. Now, shortly after that, we see the signing of the Declaration of Independence. These guys are going to meet in Philadelphia, and these 1,300 words will go down in history. And we have to remind ourselves some thought for the Revolution, like George Washington, some thought for the Revolution, like John Adams, and some wrote for the Revolution, as Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was not known to be a public speaker at all. He was terrified to speak publicly, but he's going to use his pen to really inspire the nation, inspire the colonies. And if you look here, we got John Hancock has the biggest signature. He's actually the shortest guy at the Continental Congress. Who's going to meet? He's 5'4". You can maybe argue that that's why he has a big signature. And Jefferson and Adams are going to sign on two different sides. These two guys will be opposite each other later on. They'll grow to be friends by the time they die. They actually, it's July 2nd. They pass a resolution to be independent. And John Adams believes that that date, July 2nd, would be the most memorable date. But it actually won't be till July 4th when they actually adopt the Declaration of Independence. That will be considered July 4th, Independence Day. But again, it shows us the power of narrative. It shows us where we write the story from. We could have been July 2nd we celebrate Independence Day, but it's not. The die is now cast when we look at the Declaration of Independence for America and its freedom. When the British start to pardon and offer pardons for people, these two will not be pardoned. If the Americans lose this revolution, these two guys would have been executed. They would have been hung by the British Crown. And yeah. So, and by the way, John Hancock, he's the wealthiest man in Massachusetts at the time. And he actually believed that he would be picked to lead the army, but they're going to pick somebody else. And I think they made the right choice to lead that army, and happened to be the tallest guy in the room. And his name he wasn't actually in the room, but the tallest guy that they could think of was George Washington, who towered over others. Now, George Washington, we look at this guy, we have the Washington Monument here. We kind of need to remind ourselves this guy was a man. He wasn't just a statue. He wasn't just a bust. And he was our founding father. He was the dude of the time. And, his friends gave him the nickname, the Stallion on the Potomac. And we look at this. He's somebody who is a horse rider. And he's somebody who actually could not have children. He was sterile because of the smallpox he had, as I told you, at 19 in Barbados. And he's somebody, though, who has that self-discipline, that self-control, and he believes he's a man of destiny. And he's somebody who rises to the top during the hardest times. This is why we're able to win the American Revolution. When things are bad, this guy always stays calm, cool, and collected. He's somebody who has a kind of a up and down relationship with his mother. He's somebody who does not have any correspondence with his father at all. And he's going to end up marrying the wealthiest widow in Virginia, Martha Custis. And he's going to do that a year before. He's going to renovate Mount Vernon, attempting to improve his status. He's a great dancer. He actually, historians argue that his love of his life was a lady by the name of Sally Fairfax. And they think that because that letter he wrote Sally, who was actually a wife of a friend of his, said that whenever he was with her, it was the happiest days of his life, which was later on in life that he wrote that. Only 3 letters remain between him and Martha had burned all of them but those 3. And he will actually lose his stepson in the last battle of the American Revolution, at the Battle of Yorktown. Martha's biological son, his stepson. And again, tear down that bust, even though he's a dude. Again, like Thomas Jefferson, he was somebody who was terrified to speak publicly. If you ever see him speaking publicly, there's stories of him trembling, his hands shaking. But he will die one of the richest men in America. He believes in land wealth. He's a surveyor. He was always about looking at land and surveying it and reporting back. And he has one of the greatest entrances in the White House. He has one of the greatest exits as well. And lastly, conflicting today, obviously, he owned more than 300 slaves and owned 17,500 acres of land. He's somebody who's very cheap. When he purchased slaves, he didn't purchase from a slave auction. He would go to the ship itself. And he was trying to save money. He was always about saving money. And that's George Washington again. Love or hate, he is the first president of the United States after this thing. Now, this George Washington learns that we have 2 things on our side in this American Revolution: time and space. And he realizes after the Long Island debacle that all we have to do is not lose the war. like just keep moving, keep running. You have to win some battles here and there, hit and run. But he learned that order to win was just don't lose. And this is kind of adopted from a Roman general during the Second Punic War against the Carthaginians. Fabian, the Fabian strategy it's called. It's the army does not risk fighting and losing one big battle. And this is George Washington. Survive and you shall succeed. It's a life lesson. Now, we also have, while this war is going on, we have some things going on in the background. Benjamin Franklin, he's over in France. He's visiting the French government and the brothels over there. Benjamin Franklin was somebody who was a very, I guess, womanizer in many ways. Benjamin Franklin is going to be over there. He's going to be trying to convince the French to join on the American side. Many French actually come over here because they hate the British and they see a point to get some redemption from the French and Indian War. Guys like Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, came over to America, and some other guys did too in hopes of getting some top positions. Lafayette will become very close with George Washington, become like best friends, where George Washington jokes with him. Lafayette did not bring his wife over with him, and he joked that you're afraid she's going to fall in love with an older man, which I thought was funny. And we also see some guys from Prussia, like von Steuben, and he's going to be somebody who comes over here, and he's going to help bring discipline into the army. So these Europeans are going to come in. He's going to actually set up latrines that go downstream from the camps to protect our soldiers from cholera outbreaks. And this is looking at these Europeans play a role. Now, Benjamin Franklin is going to be campaigning, but the French are not going to join in until we have a big victory. That big victory will be the Battle of Saratoga. Horatio Gates will be he's not here. Horatio Gates will be the leader of that, and it's going to inspire the French to say, okay, these guys can maybe win this war. It took place in 1777, and this will lead to the French jumping in as an ally. Now, the British, after the Battle of Saratoga, after seeing that America's not going away, they attempt to, King George attempts to, Parliament, I should say, attempts to grant all the demands that the Americans wanted. And they say, hey, listen, we will do what you wanted. We'll rescind the taxes. Let's just go back to being loyal colonists. And the Americans respond with,
halfway across the globe and we're standing on the ground, screaming across the waves, you can't hear the sound. There's no fair trials, no trade, no liberties, no tea. We've colonized America, we won't stand for tyranny.
it's supposed to be King George III.
And it's too late to apologize.
It's supposed to be Thomas Jefferson.
It's too late.
There's Benjamin Franklin.
I said it's too late to apologize. It's too late.
John Adams. That's Sam Adams.
Paid your foolish tax, read the ads, and they just won't do. We wanna make it clear we believe this much is true. All men were created with certain unalienable rights. Among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's too late to apologize. It's too late.
You're welcome for that tidbit. Now, King George III, by the way, just a little fun fact, he actually goes insane later, and many people credit to the wigs that these guys used to wear had so much mercury in them that he will actually go insane by the time he's passes away. Now, the battle rages on from 1777 all the way to 1781, and on the same exact date, October 17th, 4 years after Saratoga, on the anniversary, will be the surrender of the British at the Battle of Yorktown, which takes place in Virginia. And you can see by the map here, this is where the French really play a huge role in this. They're going to prevent any kind of evacuation for Cornwallis, who's the general. He's trapped in Yorktown. The British soldiers at Yorktown are surrounded. And then there's a song, "The World is Turned Upside Down," that the soldiers play after the battle. The British soldiers play that the Americans win this battle. Washington did not believe that this would be the last battle, but it ends up being the last battle. His stepson, as I mentioned, Martha's son, he's going to die at the age of 26 at the Battle of Yorktown. 3,600 rounds fall per day on the fort at Yorktown. And again, George Washington believed the British would continue to fight because of the idea of the domino effect. This is why the British did not want to give the 13 colonies away. They have an empire all around the world. If they lose the American colonies, they believe that they would then lose India, then they would lose other places throughout the world. And it's the same exact policy, this is the sad part of it, that we follow in Vietnam. Really, the founding of our nation, we could have studied our own history, our founding of our history, understand why we're going to lose in Vietnam. The British are going to raise the white flag. It'll take 2 more years before we see the signing of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris. And that's 1783, and it's a negotiation, and we'll see the British negotiate to give us all of the land to the Mississippi River. So we're going to double in size. One sad part is the Native Americans had no role in the negotiations, even if they had land over there close to Mississippi. The British told them they'd protect them after the 7 Years' War. We're going to see that that is not going to be the case. Americans want to go across the Appalachians. They want to expand. This is another one of the reasons why we went to war. The British told the Native Americans they would protect them, and the American colonists do not. We're too eager to go west. We're going to be going across there, and we're going to see that the French representative actually poses a toast to the Treaty of Paris, saying, "This is to the growing greatness of the Americans, destined to become the greatest empire in the world." And that guy is about a century and a half before we're there, but some heck of foresight. And really, the 2 big achievements are the fact that America gets double its size, and we're all the way from the northern part of Florida all the way to the southern part of Canada we get. And we'll see, following this, we're going to be expanding further west over time. And the sad part is those loyalists that sided with the British, they're going to be actually have their houses confiscated, their property confiscated. They're going to be assaulted. They're going to be brutalized. Some will be even executed. And tens of thousands will be making their way, and you see the picture here, making their way on ships and actually heading to, most of them settle in Canada. We'll go up there. And it's kind of reminds me of the Vietnam picture of people climbing on a helicopter. It's very similar. These people are going to be, these Americans, loyalists, are going to head to Canada. Instead of staying in the States, they lose a lot of their stuff. Again, wrong bet, and we see that it actually opens a lot of jobs, though, for these Americans who win the Revolutionary War. Those loyalists, and you got to think, these loyalists, these guys probably were the middle upper class of society in America that did not want the British to be thrown out because they had some advantages being having the Britain Empire stay. So those jobs are going to open up, be filled by Americans, and again we see the American Revolution, and this becomes a great experiment. And most Europeans, most people do not believe it's going to work. And the only way it works is if George Washington is willing to take over the title of president. And America's going to have an advantage in the sense of enlightenments in the background. We're going to be able to apply these enlightenment ideas and use those in creating this new country. So that's the American Revolution. Try to get through as quick as possible. Now, domino effect again, that causation, which was at the start of this whole unit. And we looked at the French and Indian War led to the American Revolution. Well, the American Revolution will lead to another revolution. The reason being the French, who are going to support us, they're going to send a lot of ships, they're going to spend a lot of money in attempting and send over soldiers even to defeat the British in the American Revolution. And this is going to mount up debt. And who's in power was the King Louis XVI. He's going to be, him and his wife, Marie Antoinette, they're going to live on high society, and they're going to be in the gallows, in the guillotine, by the end of this French Revolution. Now, I thought this was cool. I came across this in a book called I think it was Homo Deus or Sapiens, but it talked about the history of grass and why do we keep our yards so pristine. And this actually dates back to it's a status thing, it's a wealth thing, and people keep their yards clean because back in the day, aristocracy, nobility could afford to hire people to keep their grass really nice and neat. And they'd have these lavish parties, which would be over by their lawn. And again, they wanted to show these things off. Now, why am I talking about this? Because if you look at the French Revolution, preceding it, because of that debt, we start seeing the grass, the yards, which they thought were, the status. They're no longer able to keep them looking so pristine. They look more like this in the top left. Things are bad in this time. And if your grass was tall, people passing by would realize you don't have money because you can't afford to take care of it. So this is why we cut our yards even today, the status of it behind it. Now, we want our yards to look so nice. Now we see King Louis, he sees a lot of challenges to things going on. So in 1789, he reconvene something that hasn't been around for decades, and actually over a century and a half, 175 years. He's going to call the Estates General. And this National Assembly was supposed to be represented by 3 different groups of people. You have the clergy, and you have the nobility, and you have the common people. And it was the first time in over 175 years they met, and it's going to lead to some changes, some drastic. Now, the first estate and the second estate were your clergy and nobility. Your third estate was a common man. And the third estate was really pushing for each person should have a right to vote. And what you're going to see happen, though, is King Louis XVI is going to ignore the third estate. It's a bunch of common peasants, but we got to remind ourselves these guys are the majority of the population. He's going to ignore their demands. And what's going to happen is the third estate is going to break away from this National Assembly, and they're going to go lock themselves in something called a tennis court oath. Now, I don't remember how many members there are total in this tennis court, but they're going to lock themselves in there and write something called Declaration of Man. And this Declaration of Man declared natural rights and liberty and property and security and inalienable rights, protection of natural rights. That they get these ideas from the Enlightenment era. And again, remember, Enlightenment starts here. And we're going to see that these guys locking in, the crown has no power over this third estate. They're going to actually overthrow the nobility classes. They're going to storm the Bastille, which is the symbol of tyranny. There weren't a lot of, I think there was only like 4 or 5 prisoners in the Bastille at the time. But they're going to overthrow, they're going to storm it, they're going to take the ammunition, they're actually going to behead the guy the guard that actually opens the Bastille. Instead he hopes to save his life, but he actually gets killed as a result. And these guys are going to start beheading a lot of these people. Now, the whole revolution actually kicks off. You're not going to believe it, but actually, you guys read about it in a coffee shop. And it's going to be a young lawyer who actually stands up and he says, "To arms, citizens, to arms," brandishing a pistol. And you'll see them storm the Bastille. They'll storm Marie Antoinette and the Versailles Palace, and the French Revolution is kicked off. Now, unlike the American Revolution, this one gets a little more radical. It doesn't have such a happy ending. In the sense of the revolution comes from the bottoms up. As we mentioned, we don't know which direction they're going to go. It's going to go multiple directions. But you're going to see the reign of terror is going to come through, and you're going to see 15,000 plus people who aren't radical enough be executed. And we see the king and queen. First it's the king, then it's the queen. And you're going to see them beheaded as well by the guillotine. And this French Revolution is going to be a bloodbath for a while, eventually, until, and we see also the old Europe becomes dead in the sense of we see people clamoring for rights, clamoring for equality. European nations actually gather some armies and try to put it down, but it's going to be unsuccessful because here's a famous illustration of the French Revolution. And again, we see the power of women at this thing at the forefront. The guillotine was actually used because it was viewed as less barbaric. We can see Baccaria coming through here. It's viewed as less barbaric, less torturous. It's quick. It's relatively painless because it happens so fast. This blade's going to be dull by the time it's done, sadly enough. And some people are going to have a couple times to get the head removed. King Louis XVI, though, he will actually go up there pretty courageously. And we see the absolute monarch overthrown. But again, we have to understand power vacuums are created, and we're going to see this power vacuum with this reign of terror will be filled by some crazy people. And then eventually, after these 16,000 people are killed, and this is like the Great Purge, it's like the movie, this reign of terror. After this, people start to question, we've gone too far. We need to get somebody to fill this leadership. And this when they turn to somebody that is known for being short in history. He's actually not as short as people thought he was, but his name is Napoleon. And he's going to be somebody who's going to start up the Napoleonic Wars. And he's going to first become a consul of the state and eventually becomes emperor. He's a very ambitious guy. He is only 33 years old when the revolution kicks off in 1789, and he is going to be somebody who has a lot of success up until he decides to do something. Now, he's somebody who builds like this first kind of modern total war state, which we'll see happen quite a bit in World War I a century later. And he unifies with nationalism and French, and again, they rally around this guy. But he's going to do something catastrophic that Hitler does, and he does it. He's going to invade Moscow, and I should say invades Russia, and he's going to lose over 300,000 soldiers in Moscow on its retreat back. They're going to be freezing to death by the time they get back, and he's going to eventually lose another battle at Waterloo, and that'll be his last of his power. He's actually somebody who, when he loses the first Napoleonic War, he'll actually get power again after that, and then lose at Waterloo, and we'll never hear of Napoleon again. Now, thanks to these revolutions, we also see Latin American revolutions kick off. Again, we see Enlightenment, the idea spreading, people wanting this freedom, push off the yoke of the European oppressors. And we can see in 1800, Latin America, you can see all these colonies, which means you're controlled by these European countries. This is what Columbus's discovery leads to. We can see that over here on the right, by 1830, look how much independence we have in Latin and South America. So we do see that changing of the guard by then. Famous revolution took place in Haiti, and it's led by the guy by the name of Toussaint Louverture. And this is actually when Napoleon's still in power. This is Haiti right here. You can see on the left here. You're going to see a slave revolt overthrow their slave masters. They set up a country. Napoleon sends troops to squash it, but they're going to be unsuccessful. And you're going to see this slave revolt be the first and really only successful slave revolt in the history of the world, at least in the Western Hemisphere post 1800. We see that this is looking at, it's led by this Toussaint, and he's actually tricked to get on a French ship. He gets captured and gets executed, but the Haiti will actually survive, go on. It was a colony for the French, making sugar, growing coffee beans, and Napoleon actually wanted to use Haiti as a leapfrog into conquering North America eventually. So we can thank the Toussaint for defeating the French in Haiti, and the historians argue, because Napoleon, because he loses so many troops in Haiti and trying to put this rebellion down, that he actually will go on to sell Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana Territory to the United States at a very cheap rate that Thomas Jefferson will buy in 1801, I believe it was, or 1802. I can't remember the exact year. But again, we can thank that struggles there. So in closing here, we have, thanks to Enlightenment, thanks to the scientific revolution, we have more changes coming. And these changes are going to affect people on the rural areas, the farms. This will get us in our next unit. And we'll see that this change, is machine is going to replace man. And we're going to see the Industrial Revolution coming through. And it's really going to rattle and change things. And more people are going to be living in cities. People are going to be living next to strangers, working next to strangers like never before. Factory labor is going to take root, and people become just a cog in the machine, and working and living conditions will change drastically. They're not all negative. There's positives, there's negatives, and we understand that this urbanization is about to take root. It's going to start first in England, then it's going to spread to Western Europe, and eventually it's going to travel across the Atlantic Ocean into the United States, and we'll see this industrial revolution. Now, I also want to make sure I preface this. We'll see one country that is going to choose to stay in the dark. And we're going to see it's going to take something happening in 1853 that's going to change this. But Japan will be a country that when this revolution, the Industrial Revolution, is happening, it is going to shut its doors to all foreigners. And it's something that it will not reopen until 1853. And although the individual Japanese were fascinated with this Western technology that's coming with the Industrial Revolution, they fear that it's going to lead to too much drastic change in Japan. They fear these Western ways. They fear the missionaries sending all these Christians out, trying to change their religion in Japan. There's even a story of a Spanish captain who insulted the Japanese emperor, which he did not do in Japan. And the Japanese will actually arrest him and the missionaries and have each of them crucified as a means. And they will only let the Dutch enter the port of Nagasaki once a year, and they'd actually forced these Dutch to walk on crosses before they entered into the soil of Japan to kind of send a message that do not bring your religion in here. You can bring your goods, but do not bring your religion. And again, we'll talk about 1853, how something happens. But this concludes. Just want to show you where we're heading with the Industrial Revolution. And we have a lot of changes happening, which will get us up to World War I, which will obviously conclude our topics, our units on the year. Until next time, stay safe, have fun, take care.